I'll take it very, very quickly, just a brief introduction that we would normally do at the beginning of the course. And if you look at our website, you will find that in the database section, database, that's me, John Watson, and that's our Managing Director, Dave, who's moderating today. My background, I saw there were a few familiar names on this list. I'm afraid those of you who I've met before will have heard all my jokes already. But apart from that, for the rest of you, I've been hacking away at the Oracle database for about 30 years, one way or another. I've done all the qualifications that there are and written a fair few books for Oracle Press as well. And with regard to RAC and grid infrastructure, I've been hacking away at it since the days of Parallel Server. And that's all I'm going to do in the way of introduction now for this particular event. So let's proceed with what we want to cover. We're going to dive straight into Chapter 2 of our formal course. Chapter 2 of the course is the architecture chapter, the architecture chapter. We call it Grid Infrastructure Fundamentals, in that and it's fundamental because the content that we cover in this is critical for your understanding of the rest of the course. It's quite straightforward. If you get the architecture straight in your head, you can work out the detail for yourself within certain limits. Now, the environment we work within for this course, by the way, you each get your own cluster. It's a 4-node cluster, with a 5th node used for network services. So your environments will be basically your environments will be 4 machines to use as database servers, plus a 5th machine that provides facilities such as DNS, DHCP, NFS. You will get your own cluster. For this first introductory chapter, Grid Infrastructure Fundamentals, I'm going to be using a little cluster that I built on a virtualized environment that I've got here. So I'll just show you the environment I'll be working on. Don't bother too much about syntax. Syntax you learn as you do the exercises on the real course. But OLS node shows me that I'm working on a little 2-node cluster. On our full course, we go from 2 nodes to 4 nodes. We expand the cluster as we work through the week. And on this cluster, I've got a few the resources configured. This is the cluster I've configured already. And what I've got running on this cluster is I'll pick out as a highlight some of the resources that we're going to be covering in our architectural analysis. I've got listeners to support FlexASM. FlexASM is a 12c facility. I've got a disk group called CW Files. The CW Files disk group that contains my clusterware files, the voting disk, the cluster registry. I have a data disk group. I've created a database on that. And then I have what we call node listeners. Much more of them probably in about 40 minutes' time. I have scan listeners. SCAN, an important acronym, Single Client Access Name. The SCAN, the Single Client Access Name, is the entry point to the cluster that all the users will be using. And we run listeners on the SCAN addresses. There are my ASM instances. Because I'm using FlexASM, I have by default 3, but because it's a 2-node cluster, as we see here, only 2 of them are running at the moment. So my ASM instances are up. Virtual IP addresses. There's a database called JW. And JW is online with instances on both nodes. My management database, by the way, I've shut that down just to save some resources. And there are my scan VIPs, the virtual IP addresses on which these scan listeners will be listening. And that's pretty much what we're going to cover in this chapter. The architecture that's going to tie all these things together, how they work together, what their purpose is. So, architecture. If any of you have asked questions already, you go straight to the top of the class. Remember, communicate, communicate, communicate. So,
nothing in the queue so far, John. We're waiting for our first question.
Oh dear, so they all go to the bottom of the class. Oh well, come on guys, talk back to us. Now, And we don't have time to go through asking you to introduce yourselves, of course. Normally we would do to get an idea of where you're coming from, your background with Oracle, whether you've been administering databases for 20 years or whether you can't even spell SQL. We need that sort of background. We can't do that with a group this size. So we begin with a review of the database instance architecture. I'm going to skip over that almost completely today, unless any of you chat in that you'd like a bit more information on this. Remember that. Otherwise, I'm going to skip over this, because with a large group, we can't be sure, we don't know what prerequisites you all have. But assuming we get past that quickly, we'll talk about why you should use RAC at all. And that's much more important than you might think, why you would use it. Then, the nitty-gritty of the technical content. The enabling technology for grid infrastructure, the shared storage, the use of virtual IP addresses, name resolution. Name resolution can be a very complex subject, fraught with problems in a grid infrastructure environment. And a brief word of the synchronization services that make the cluster actually work. So that's our enabling technology. Towards the end of the chapter, we'll have a word at grid infrastructure, GI. GI for application servers. Ever since grid infrastructure was first introduced in release 11.2, it's been possible to use grid infrastructure to provide high availability services for resources other than databases. You can use grid infrastructure to provide HA for your Apache web listener, for your email server, for your Tomcat Java containers, and so on. But in release 12, the capability to do that has been greatly enhanced with what is called the Flex cluster capability. So at the very end of the chapter, a brief word about Flex clusters, using grid infrastructure to protect your application services, as well as databases. Then the exercise at the end of this chapter, we're not going to do the exercise today because we can't give you all clusters to do it on. But in the normal course, at the end of this chapter, you would then prepare your nodes for the installation of grid infrastructure and the initial configuration. So that's the content we'll be covering today. After that, we'll have a short break, and then a demonstration of something we'd normally do later on in the course. Later on, after the break, I'll take a single instance database in the form of a backup, just an RMAN backup, and I will convert it to a clustered database, put it onto the shared storage, onto ASM, create the instances, make adjustments needed, and start it up. So this chapter is the theory, and after break, I'll demonstrate the practice.